going.
Awesome.
All right. Good morning. This is the September 3rd, 2021 meeting of the Vermont Climate Council's Agriculture and Ecosystems Subcommittee. Welcome, everyone. Let's see. Our agenda today, we're going to do some administrative stuff right off and then provide an update to the subcommittee on some work that the task leads have been doing around the strategies and action items matrix and discuss some next steps there. Then we'll hear from Jane on some updates on the steering committee and some guidance on how we're going to prioritize our strategies and actions going forward. We're going to hear about the scheduled agriculture stakeholders meeting from John and Pat. We'll have our first opportunity for public comment around 11. And then most of the second half of the meeting, we're going to focus on trying to dig into some of the kind of bigger issues that have emerged in our strategies and recommendations that we think may be controversial or, need some further debate and discussion amongst this group. Then we'll set our agenda for next week here. So do any subcommittee members have any comments on either that agenda or the minutes from last meeting? Seeing no response, I will say that we've approved both those things. So thank you. Let's see. All right. Well, I guess I'm just looking at the chat to see if I'm missing anyone. All right, cool. So I'm going to give a little bit of an update on the pathways and strategies and action items. So kind of stepping back a little bit, we all some time ago broke into our kind of task lead groups and developed really well thought strategies under our 7 pathways. We combined all those into one big list, and it was significant. It was, several to, over, I think, 300 different individual strategies. The task group leads, along with Charlie's help, has been working for the past couple of weeks to try to sort through all that information, see if we can come up with strategies that span the different task groups and provide a little bit more structure into that list. We're not losing anything. We've kept every single suggestion, strategy, action item, question that has come up through the task group process, and we'll maintain that throughout the course of our work. But our goal is to really reduce the number of overall strategies and then focus on the action items that nest under them. As we've been working through this process, we've kind of realized that many of the strategies that the task groups have surfaced really are actions of one sort or another, and that there are these higher level strategies that are kind of shared across many of those actions. So that group met again this morning for a couple hours from 8 to 10, or excuse me, from 8 to 9:30. So that's why, John, some of us were quiet when we first came on, because we've already been at this for a while today. But I don't think we're at a point where we are ready to share kind of a visual or a document with you all, but we're going to meet again early next week. And after that, we hope to have ready to share with the full subcommittee in advance of next Friday's meeting, a document that has our pathways, these newly kind of suggested roll-up strategies under those pathways, and then all the associated action items that you all have developed. And then potentially some comments on which action items maybe necessitate further discussion by this group to determine whether we should continue to include them in our work. And then some that maybe just aren't germane or under the purview of our work that maybe should be shipped off to other subcommittees. So that's our intent before next Friday, is to kind of get that book of work to you all in some form or another. And again, really what we're trying to do is not lose anything, but just provide a little bit more order to the many, many actions we're recommending, so that as we begin to prioritize and determine which need to be, immediate actions in this plan, which actions fall within the purview of rulemaking, legislation, funding, state agencies, or actions that average Vermonters can kind of do on their own on an ongoing basis, this exercise is going to hopefully get us there. So that's a very high level overview. And I know we've got a decent block of time scheduled for this. So I would invite any of the other task leads or Charlie or Pat or whomever who's been part of this process to share thoughts or comments or correct anything I just represented, and then invite any questions from subcommittee members.
Questions, comments? Task group leads, anything else to add? Charlie, you also helped out. Thank you so much. So Lauren, anything to add there? Good. Charlie? All right. Okay. So
Took a bite too soon.
yeah, no problem. So again, I think that one thing just to emphasize to the steering committee as a whole, so nothing is being dropped from the spreadsheets. It's all being reorganized. And so as Billy said, they're going to continue that work next week so they can have a kind of the document right now is kind of in slightly different formats and approaches right now. So it's a bit of a mess to look at, but they're going to hammer it into shape, as Billy said. And then again, they're going to identify for discussion then on next Friday, particularly those actions or strategies that probably bear more discussion because they maybe belong someplace else, maybe write another subcommittee, or because maybe people think they might be controversial and the group needs to talk about them. It's likely that most of the strategies will probably be doable, though we'll see. But certainly some of the actions are likely to need to bear some more conversation among all of you. So any questions for the task group leads about this?
I just have a clarifying question about the actual process. Are we going to create a comprehensive list of actions for every single strategy that we're putting forward in the plan? And if we're not, how are the select actions being chosen?
Good question.
It's a great question, Iris. At this point, I think our plan is to try to find a place under the strategies for all the actions that we've surfaced as a group. And then I think once we've done that, we'll need to kind of collectively decide how we proceed, right? There's going to be a lot of action items. And I think that may be part of the prioritization exercise that, the steering committee and council are going to work on. But, I think the place that we're starting from is that we don't want to lose anything. So there'll hopefully be an opportunity in the plan to compile everything that, we've come up with if we agree they're good ideas. And then probably we'll need to kind of prioritize based on kind of when in time they happen, whether they need funding, legislative action, or there are things that people can just do. So I think we'll get some direction from the council on that, but that will be a task before us in the coming weeks.
Okay, that sounds good. Thank you.
And some things that were listed as in the earlier spreadsheet as strategies have actually become sub-strategies or actions themselves. So you'll see kind of some of that sorting as it goes. And some broader strategies now have a whole bundle of actions associated with them, and some don't have so many. So
yeah, and just another example, since we were working kind of in a siloed way in our task groups, there was a number of strategies that were duplicated by multiple groups, like related to land conservation and increased educational technical assistance, things of that nature. So, at the highest level, we're just trying to see where all those commonalities are and roll those up into, fewer or single strategies that can apply broadly across our work.
any other questions at this point about that kind of the lumping and sorting? David, any questions? No, good. Judy, any questions?
No, I'm good.
Okay. All right. Well, maybe, I don't know, Billy, maybe we just keep moving on to our next agenda item. What do you think?
Lauren's got her hand up.
Okay. All right.
Well, I'd just like the moment to fill the space. I think we're waiting for Jane anyway, and she's on the next agenda item. So if Abby is listening, I wanted to take a moment to acknowledge that earlier this week, Abby was inducted into the Ag Hall of Fame for Vermont. So I just wanted to take the time. I wish I could see her face in the field right now, but Abby, people are clapping for you. So anyway, I wanted to embarrass you publicly, but also give you some kudos that is well deserved.
mean, thank you, Lauren, but also I'm mad.
What did they give you? A pen, a pitchfork? What do they give you?
Wait, can you hear me?
Yeah,
Yep.
sound good.
Now we can't.
I guess maybe can she hear us?
Sorry, I couldn't tell, but thank you, Lauren, and I am embarrassed and I never know how to handle that stuff, but thank you.
You're welcome. Hey, Billy, there was a question in the chat about there is a public member who has a comment on the lumping and sorting. I don't know whether you want to take a brief public comment before we go forward. Or you want to have people wait until we come to our comment period later?
I'm inclined to wait, but I would take the temperature of the group. Okay, looks like I think we'll just wait. So if you could hold that comment, Zach, that's great. We can tie it back to this conversation later. Okay. Let's see. We're still without Jane.
I can give an update on the stakeholder. John, I can give an update on the stakeholder meeting first if you want to go there, and then we can circle back to Jane if you want.
Sure, Marion, you think that will work for your guys' schedule?
Yep.
Sure, please.
Okay, I don't, John, if you want to say, I will project up kind of the draft agenda developing and stuff, but John, maybe you can say a few words to start about where we're at with the kind of the stakeholder meeting.
Yeah, I could. I'm assuming I got assigned this, Pat, after I left the meeting.
You did, as you told us not to.
The dangers of leaving a meeting. Anyway, I don't know whether you want to share, or whether you can, Pat, the actual invitation.
Sure,
But
I can do.
you know, in the organization I head up, I've sent this out to 120 members, urging them to attend. It's going to be on the evening, 6 to 8 p.m. on the evening of Tuesday, September 14th. It's basically an invitation to all farmers, farm-related businesses, technical service providers, farmer support groups, organizations, conservation groups, conservation districts, anyone to attend. And, you know, we're asking for registration prior to attendance. Unfortunately, this is what really we need to do to be able to control some potential bad actors. So anyway, we will be discussing strategies for helping Vermont farms and food systems to be more resilient and adaptable, ways Vermont Ag can play an essential role in storing and sequestering carbon, and many co-benefits of climate action. Farm viability, healthy soils, increased biodiversity, water quality, and many others. Well, it's all there in front of you. I did have one question, Pat, actually. Did you specifically send this invite to the leadership of the watershed groups, or do you need my help to do that?
Good question. I'm going to turn, Alyssa's been super helpful in reaching out to a variety of networks. So Alyssa, do you want to kind of speak to the list you gave me to make sure this went out to?
Yeah, so Pat did send this to a group that included leadership from the farmer watershed groups. I know that Catherine Davidson sent it to the membership of the Farmer Watershed Alliance. I haven't heard confirmation that the Connecticut River Farmer Watershed Alliance has circulated the invitation yet, but Marley Roop did offer to reach out directly to Paul Doughton and make sure that that happens.
I could do
and
that
then
too. Yeah.
Oh, that would be great. That would be great if you could encourage Paul to do that. And then the other piece is NOFA Vermont has agreed to help get the word out and kind of co-sponsor. And so I don't think they've sent it out yet, but they are happy to.
I guess if anybody has any questions, Pat will answer them.
And we also sent it to the PES working group because there's a lot of related folks there. And we also sent it to the Ag Commission folks as well, just so they had it. I think there were some extension folks on there as well to kind of get the word out as well.
I wonder if there is a group, the Vermont, I always muddle up the name, even though I'm a member of it, the Vermont Soil Health Healthy Network group. I don't know, Alyssa, whether you sent it to them or copied them on it.
Which one?
The Vermont Healthy Soils Network group.
Nice. I didn't send it out yet, but I do. I intend to do today. If you want to do it, that's fine. Or I can send it.
Whichever works.
I'll do it.
Okay. Thanks.
Alyssa, Abby's suggesting also to the Vermont grass farmers, and I think rural Vermont's maybe already on the list, but rural Vermont and the Vermont grass farmers too.
Great.
Okay, great. And Jake, what I'll do is when we're done today, I'll make sure this goes out to all the membership here. It's in a Word version, then you can send it out as you guys see fit. The other thing I was going to do, Jonathan, is okay, I was going to share the agenda so you guys can see kind of what we're going to cover. And then our small task group from here that's working on it is going to meet to work on presentations and the like next week. And we hope to bring you a draft of what they're going to present next Friday, so you all can review it and make sure you're comfortable with what's going to be presented publicly. But let me share the agenda so you can see that. 1 second here. I think this is the right agenda. So really quickly, you know, there's going to be, oops, that's not the right agenda. That's the wrong agenda. Sorry, that's today's agenda. We don't want that one. We want another one. Bear with me one second. I have the wrong agenda. Hide that one, pull up another one. That's not it. Here we go. Okay. Sorry about that. Give me agenda so little time. All right. All right, here we go. Okay. So Abby, if you're willing, we're going to have you open as, you know, the farmer co-chair of the group, just to say a few words and talk about kind of the process people have gone through to kind of develop work to date. We have some co-sponsors as noted. So right now, so John's group and NOFA, and if we have others, we want to give them a place to speak and just say a few words. And then Jane's going to set the context for kind of just the Vermont Climate Council writ large and the climate plan broadly to set a bit of context. And then Ryan's going to really talk a little bit about the link to all the good work Ag has already done around water quality and other issues and how that is related and a good foundation for the work going forward. And Ag is not actually part of the problem, but actually a key part of the solution here going forward. And then David and Alyssa are going to present the strat. We decided to not use the word pathways because it felt like confusing to people, but essentially the pathways and strategies, you know, that you all are developing, and they will share with you that slideshow next week so you can see it. We take some initial questions from the subcommittee, and then we would go to breakout groups, which I'll explain in a second, and go through kind of these 4 questions. By the way, we can modify these if you think they should be different. And then there'll be some report backs, next steps, and close. So it's a pretty full agenda. What we thought in breakout groups is in order to make people feel kind of comfortable and in smaller groups where they can talk more freely, we thought we might send people off to kind of either some of the co-sponsors of the event or kind of subgroups where they might be comfortable within their region or the like. So we're still sorting out the details, but we'll have essentially some trusted or known faces in that room. Want you all to participate if you're willing, particularly to be in the breakouts to engage with and hear from the farmers. We'll have some kind of moderator type in each of those and someone taking notes. So we really would like everyone on the subcommittee, if you can, to participate and be, probably primarily listening, but people may have questions in the breakout groups you can answer too. So we're hoping for that as well. So that's the draft agenda, and I think happy to take any input, comment, or revisions to this. We haven't released it yet. We wanted you all to look at it and kind of approve it before we make it available.
I have a couple questions, but I would ask others to go ahead of me if other folks have questions or comments. Okay. So I think this looks great, and thank you all for pulling this together. And maybe at the end we can talk briefly about some other stakeholder meetings that we're working on developing. I think this approach is logical and makes good sense from my perspective. My main question relates to kind of what you all are, what we're actually going to present to the public as far as pathways, strategies, and action items, given that that work is kind of, the refinement of those are kind of underway, and they're quite in flux right now. And I know that just based on our conversation this morning, many of things that heretofore had been considered strategies, we're looking at as action items, potentially the development of new strategies. So I think we'll have some clarity on that by next Friday, which is prior to this meeting. But just want to kind of put out there that, all this stuff is happening concurrently. And, what we shared with the Climate Council a month ago has evolved. So that's my only comment.
John, do you have a comment to that?
I just have a quick question, Pat. On the invitation, the register link is not a live link.
Huh.
Or-
Oh, I see what you mean on the registration itself, right?
Is that
Gotcha.
possible to make that live link? It just would it would reduce steps necessary.
You think I could do that, but I might need some help. So yes, but it may take me a few hours to get some staff person to help me. Or if Marion can work her magic, because the link is, if you can work your magic, Marion, maybe you can do it. And
Yeah, I can try.
Thank you. Sorry, John.
Thank you.
Alyssa, and then David to Billy's good question.
Yeah, this may be similar to David's comment, but David and I are tasked with presenting our strategies and ideas to this group. And I know that is a lot of you are working on refining how that's organized right now. We pushed this event to be a little earlier because farmers were concerned that they're going to be heavy into harvest season by the end of September. And so we really pushed to get the earliest as possible so that we could get more participation from farmers. So that's why we're kind of making this happen is at the date that it is really the earliest that we could get. And so I wondered if those of you that are working on organizing and synthesizing all of our strategies together would be willing to loop David and I into a draft or some of that work by mid next week so that we have a little bit of head time to create slides for the presentation. Even if they're not final, it just would give us more than the weekend to put it together.
Billy, what's your sense of timing there? Then I'll go to David.
So the task leads are meeting next Wednesday morning to kind of pick things up. So I think, if kind of like by midweek, kind of midday, late Wednesday would work for you, Alyssa, I think that's probably doable. I don't want to speak for anyone, but I also imagine that folks like Ryan and others, Marley, who are working on Abby, who are working on the ag task groups, can kind of walk you through the thinking as well. But yeah, long way of saying we should have something to share by the middle of next week. That's probably not complete, but it will give you something to work with.
David, you had a comment or question? Oh, David, yeah. And David, I can put the agenda back on yet in one second.
Yeah, thanks. I was just reflecting on, we're not going to have that much time to talk about, 15 minutes or so to present this. So it'll necessarily be high level. And, I'm assuming, Alyssa and I will connect in advance, but my thought is to kind of hit the high points. One of the main high points, I think, for this particular group, it's similar for forests, frankly, and ecosystems, is the fact that we're looking at agriculture not simply in the context of reducing emissions, though that's an important piece of the work, but also, and frankly, more importantly, as a source of storage and sequestration. So that's a key theme, I think, that we need to stress. And, if others have other key themes that you think we should identify. I do think, from hearing from just some of the buzz, which I think is still moderate. I don't think anyone except insiders are really paying attention to this at the moment. But some of the buzz was, about whether or not the Climate Council is heading towards a set of recommendations that will force the contraction of farming in Vermont. And others who are expecting that this, or maybe hoping that this will force a shift away from conventional dairy farming as a major component of our ag economy. So I expect that those will be tensions that will come forward. And of course, neither of those are things that our recommendations to date are certain. There's certainly no direct connection to any of those. What the ultimate outcomes of our ag future are unknown to me. But I thought those would be key themes for us to focus on at the outset to try to address what I think may be some key points of debate. And then, people can, that doesn't prevent people from still arguing about it, but I'm hopeful that they'll shift more into the actual details of the kinds of goals and recommendations that we're suggesting.
Jake.
Yeah, just a comment about the four bulleted kind of guiding questions. I think it would be good to not only have the question about strategies or ideas of concern, but the 2 or 3 strategies of that seem like high leverage, of high interest to this group of stakeholders. And I think that should be kind of a consistent, type of question across these sessions, is like the things of concern, but also the things that you feel like are strategies that would be highly effective. Because, part of this process is to help us in our prioritization. So we want to know what's resonating with people, as well as what's concerning to them.
Great. Thanks, Jake. And again, any other, I added the word goals as Lauren suggested. So it's developing goals and strategies for the climate action plan. And then added the thing that Jake just said. Judy.
Sorry, I'm blacked out today. I have a lot of crazy construction going on here, people coming and going. But I have a question. Will the strategies and actions and all of that Billy talked about previously be completed when this happens?
I think the hope is that we're going to have it a bit more refined than it is now, and at a point that can inform these conversations. It's not going to be completed until the full subcommittee has the ability to kind of digest, weigh in, and make some decisions about what we move forward. So I'm hoping that next Friday we can do a lot of that work. Whether we as a subcommittee feel like we're done by next Friday is an open question. So I think my hope is that at least an initial review by the full subcommittee will occur prior to the stakeholder meeting. And hopefully we'll have some good direction out of that conversation, and maybe we'll be done and we can call it complete. But if not, I'm hoping there's enough guidance from this group in advance of the stakeholder meeting that it can be a productive conversation.
So will they have access to what's been done already?
Yep, we're going to hope to have that out to this whole group, the whole subcommittee, by the middle of next week, so that you all have something to review prior to next Friday. And then this stakeholder meeting is the week after that.
Okay, thank you.
And then just to be clear too, Alyssa and I think Marion and Jane are going to work to develop a slideshow that David and the planning group, Alyssa and others will review Thursday, and try to link this all up. But we'll bring you that. So sometime on the Friday meeting, we'll go through that slideshow so you know what the intent is to present, and we'll make modifications to it so you all are comfortable with what is or isn't being presented, so that you will be fully vet what's going to go in front of the public. Is the agenda, I think the only other thing is if the agenda looks okay with the good changes you all suggested, I will clean it up slightly and send it off to be, and it can actually go out for broader public consumption. So is everybody on the subcommittee okay with the agenda as it's shaping up? Jane, you had one other thing in chat. Do you want to mention that? Because it might go to the questions in the agenda.
Oh, well, we've been thinking a lot about the draft outreach materials after they came out, and rethinking sort of the moment in time that we're at, where we're going out to the public, a recognition that by the time we get public input back in mid-October, the what of climate action will sort of be past that in the climate action plan. So being really thoughtful about how we engage with the public to ensure that we can really use their feedback at the right time. We've been starting to reframe the outreach questions at the how, like how do we get at the solutions? Because we'll be at the point where we'll be sort of working through our actions and prioritizing them. And that's really the how. And then also like going forward, thinking about the implementation phase. And so someone said this comment to me yesterday from the Public Service Department, and I just really liked it about the how or what we should be valuing in these solutions. And it gets at the criteria that we've been thinking about around how we frame prioritization. So equity, cost effectiveness, impact, or progress towards the GWSA requirements, co-benefits, et cetera. And then I really liked the question of sort of like what are the practical barriers in your life to participating in these solutions? So I just thought I'd put it in the chat as you were thinking about the questions.
Great. And Jane, are you suggesting any maybe modifications to the bullets, or the bullets okay, but we'll take that good as further detail as we go forward?
Well, it's just a question again, like, the pathways and strategies. I ask you all if you're very focused on that in your questions here. And I think that's appropriate, probably, but you'll be as a subcommittee really thinking about actions at this point. So the how again. And so just wondering if there's a question in there somehow where you get at that beyond the strategies and which is really the what to me. And I see Alyssa's question about a survey for event participants. That survey isn't really, that's being developed as part of the outreach, is really part of the statewide outreach. We haven't really thought about how or if that survey would be used in the stakeholder events, but that I guess is possible. I'm not sure if it'll be ready because those events are really now the third week of September and into October. We've sort of just so folks know, all those outreach materials that you may or may not have seen on the website that were Marion was thoughtful to go back and mark clearly as draft, because I know they raised consternation for some people because they appeared as final. They were presented to Just Transitions last week. We're really rethinking them and really almost starting over, I would say, so in many capacities. So happy to speak to that if people are interested. Alyssa, go ahead.
Yeah, Jane, I think just our previous conversations about these events, you have mentioned that there would be a survey and kind of these materials prepared to help with the events. And I wonder if you don't have a final draft of your survey that you're using for the other outreach events, I wonder if you would be willing to at least share, or you and Marion could help develop a draft one for this event. I think it's a really valuable way to capture participants' input while they're there and while they're thinking about it. And there's a lot that people don't say out loud, especially if a lot of folks show up and maybe mixed audience. And so if you don't have like the big final version, can we at least make a draft version that can be used for this event that's fairly simple?
Yeah, so I think, yeah, Marion was just pinging me. I do think we're getting confused a little bit on like what this event is and what I've been referring to, and that's probably my fault. But there's sort of these components of outreach. There's the statewide engagement, and then we've been thinking about additive events where you all activate your networks and go out with the collateral, the outreach materials that are developed to bring forward and get engagement on the broader climate action plan. This is specifically a stakeholder event around technical input on your strategies and actions, and it is in addition to and outside of our engagement. I know this feels like so confusing to me as I'm even saying it, so it's probably being received that way. I think there is very much a question around, it would be great if those materials and or that survey is ready when you do these, so that you can direct them to the other engagement events that are happening And that survey and that process, it will not be tailored to the agricultural component of this work. And I think that's a very fair question if you want to think about how you receive the feedback from this meeting. But the way we've done it for the technical engagement that we had in the cross-sector space was purely through note-taking in the focus groups and a consolidation of those notes, which is what I had shared with you all during the last time we met, that Catherine Morris facilitated and then put together for those events in service to the subcommittee so that you could use the feedback that you heard. But these are sort of outside of the engagement, which does have a survey and does have materials, and then also has a place to support subcommittee members and counselors to going out to additional events.
Not one thing we could do, and maybe I'm aware of the time too, but is the if people aren't somewhat adept at technology, which may be a challenge here, we have this thing called Mentimeter, which allows people to kind of it's a little fancier than the chat in Zoom, where people can enter additional comments. People who aren't maybe as verbal can still say stuff. So it wouldn't be a survey per se, but it would be a way for people to enter more written stuff as we talk, for people who feel like maybe not as comfortable verbally speaking. So we certainly could do something like that if people are interested. Maybe that's something our planning group can take back for next week.
Yeah, this sounds a little different than what I feel like we talked about in previous meetings. And so if I misunderstood or if the plan changed, I don't think that really matters. But where we are now is that we want to capture as much feedback as possible in this meeting that we have planned next week or the week after next. And I think this survey could really add to that. If Marion and Jane, you feel like that's outside the capacity of the committee, the Climate Council to support, I think I see Abby's comment in the chat that maybe that's something that we can create, either CBI or one of the subcommittee members. And I would be happy to help with that and wonder who else feels that that's important and worthwhile.
So I have a quick question. I just want to make sure, if we do a survey specific for this event, can we tailor it to this event and it won't necessarily be reflective of some broader survey format? But if we can do that, I don't see any problem with being able to do that, as long as it's okay that it's going to be tailored to this. Is that okay? Okay. So I think, Alyssa, if you're willing to help, why don't you and I bounce around? I mean, you're part of the planning group anyway. So and I know you're really busy this week doing other things. So maybe you and I can bounce around some ideas with the small group, and then next week when we have our meeting at 4 on Thursday to keep planning, we can go through that and make sure it looks right. And then we can create a poll everywhere, or a SurveyMonkey link we can put into the chat as we start, and then we can leave that open for even longer than that night too. Does that work? Okay. Real quickly, and I know I'm aware of time, and I know Billy wants to talk about the forest stuff. Great, Abby, thank you. I do want some steering committee members to come to each of the breakout groups. I'll facilitate one small group, but we probably need 2 other facilitators who will just help moderate the discussion, not necessarily weigh in on the viewpoints. So I don't necessarily have to fill this out this minute, but if anybody has any quick volunteering for any of this, let me know, and otherwise we'll pester you via email or otherwise.
If you're asking us to moderate or facilitate a conversation about agriculture or forestry, you guys are not paying us enough. That is serious emotional energy and skills you're asking of us.
Totally fair point. I mean, one thing is we could, I don't know, Jane maybe could facilitate a group, maybe Marion could. Then we've got, then we do have actually paid staff actually facilitating, David, to your point. And then also you guys as subcommittee members can be there to just engage with people, which I think would be really quite nice.
I was kind of teasing, but I do, it's not a light lift to be in these conversations.
No, that's right.
I plan to be there. Marion and I have like 10 of these events coming up. And so Marion and I are very much parsing out like staff capacity on these. So let's just touch base and make sure Marion needs to be at this, because there's other ones she's going to be leaving on.
Totally fair. And again, we'll see how registration goes. If we have more co-sponsors, we might have 4 groups versus 3. We'll sort that out in the next week. Okay, thank you all. Really appreciate the good feedback and the like. And I'll get this agenda cleaned up so that can be posted as well.
So just very briefly, there is an interest in doing a couple additional stakeholder events focused on the kind of forest and natural land side of our work. There's been a whole book of emails on that topic amongst the coordinators recently that I'm not totally up to speed on, but I think the latest is that we're looking to schedule 2 events. David's been very helpful in reaching out to stakeholders to organize these. One focused on forest landowners, managers, and kind of the forest processing sector. And then another focused on conservation interests, advocates, and folks that share an interest in forests and natural lands from that perspective. And I think those are going to be a little bit later in September, and we're just working with partners right now to try to come up with an invite list and all that stuff. And David, I don't know if you want to speak to it in more depth, but we can share more on that as that gets further fleshed out.
Yeah, thanks, Billy. I know you captured it just right. But while I've got Charlie on the and you on the and Marion all on the line at the same time, just to confirm, I've Jamie Fidel of Vermont Natural Resources Council and also the chair of Vermont Forest Roundtable has agreed to do outreach to the environmental and conservation community, which I'm thinking will include, not just the mainstream environmental groups, but also watershed groups, local community groups, conservation districts, and the like. So hopefully that will go out broadly from him. And then secondly, Kathleen Warner and the Vermont Woodlands Association has agreed to do outreach to her membership and other groups that are doing similar work like Vermont Coverts. So the only thing that's left is I'm hoping that Charlie would be able to use some of his contacts in the Vermont Forest Products Association and other related groups. And once that invitation goes out, and if they're willing to help coordinate, then I think, Marion, it's just up to you and David Plum to just follow up on logistics, in terms of the dates and times and all that.
Super. Well, seeing lots of nodding. Thank you, David, for leading this effort and reaching out to partners, and for Jamie and others supporting this. Great. Okay. Everyone ready to move on? Okay, looking good. So we leapfrogged Jane's. Yes, Judy, thank you. That is definitely one of the stakeholders that we are looking to include in these meetings, and we'll work with you to make sure we get invites to the right people. So thank you for that reminder. So with that, let's move on to Jane and Marion. I think you had a topic for us that we skipped over.
We did. Was it the prioritization, update on the steering committee? Okay. Yes. Thanks, Billy. I saw this on the agenda, and I think this was largely on the agenda, just recognizing at the fast pace at which you all are moving as a subcommittee around the body of work and putting together your pathways and strategies and moving into actions. So I don't plan to share anything on the thought process right now behind prioritization, because that is going to the steering committee for the Tuesday meeting today, and then will be hopefully advanced to the full climate council for the 14th. But wanted to speak to the fact that there is a lot of moving parts behind the scenes right now in order to support the steering committee and the climate council in thinking about how we get to a climate action plan and how we think about prioritization. The first piece being a recognition of how and where prioritization should happen and at what level. And so Marion, myself, Pat Field, David Plum, we've been working a lot over the course of the last 2 weeks to come to consensus on how to pose that process to the steering committee and ultimately to the council to support a conversation around that. And again, that will happen on Tuesday. That's also in support of and recognition that there's been for a number of weeks now a proposal being considered for how we engage and with counselors to support a formal process to draft the climate action plan that relies not only on state staff, but also counselors' engagement on pulling together the climate action plan, thinking about prioritization, thinking about cross-cutting themes and how those are elevated and spoken to in the climate action plan, as well as how we take the work from subcommittees and tie it all together into the climate action plan. That will also be a topic of discussion and hopefully adopted on Tuesday at the steering committee, and then brought to the full council to invite additional counselors into the conversation on the 14th. So mindful that everything is moving really fast right now. Marianne and I wanted to support that behind the scenes because things were taking longer, largely because of agency staff to move to finally adopting at the 7th and 14th. So hopeful that that process will be in line with what you are all thinking. I don't think it will be any surprise. It's built largely off of some of the criteria that we've discussed with all of you and been speaking to around how we lift up and speak to transparently the 5 criteria being equity, cost effectiveness, co-benefits, impact, which is progress towards the GWSA requirements and goals, and then technical feasibility and how we do that in a consistent way across the subcommittees that are elevating pathway strategies and actions. So I'm hopeful that that work will move forward over the course of next week and be able to be provided back out to the subcommittees for a clear process, recognizing that I think at this point, the timeline that we have in front of us, consistency and is really important in order to ensure fluid transition into climate action plan drafting. And perhaps while I have the floor, I'll just mention one of the key components of prioritization and thinking about how we elevate and prioritize actions is our equity work and the formally adoption and operationalizing of the guiding principles and the scoring rubric as a component of that. And I'll just say, like, I know I slept better last night because we have a consultant who we've brought on board, are bringing on board, I should say, but we've selected a consultant to support subcommittees and councils in that work. And we're in the contract negotiation phase of that right now. And so I'm hopeful that by the end of next week, that person will be able to come on board and roll out a plan for how they'll work with subcommittees to apply the scoring rubric to the actions that you're elevating. So that's all I have on that, but I'm more than happy to answer any questions or speak to how it feels in line with the process that you're currently working through.
Thanks, Jane. I just have a couple thoughts. That sounds like a good process and look forward to seeing that come through the steering committee. I think our subcommittee may be unique in that we have like a really broad scope and breadth of interest, and that we will likely have action items that are not at the same kind of scale that some of the prioritization is focused around. Like, I think the rubric you talked about, definitely when considering how to prioritize things that need kind of legislative action or funding or rulemaking or kind of program development, that all sounds great. We may have a series of action suggestions that are things that kind of the average Vermonter can pursue, or things that partners or other stakeholders can just move forward without kind of significant investment or change. And I think we're somewhat at a loss on how to include those in the plan and how to prioritize those. So just putting that out there for you and the steering committee to consider, because we may have a bucket of ideas that we're not exactly sure what to do with, but don't want to be lost in an appendix or just kind of waste away on the shelf someplace. So, welcome others to weigh in on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's one of the things that we'll reiterate in putting forward the process is that The climate action plan as currently contemplated will show all pathways and strategies in the body of the climate action plan. So no pathways or strategies will be in appendix. They'll all be in the front and center of the plan, where we start to like whittle and think about how the specificity and details at the action level. However, actions that are prioritized or for ready for implementation versus actions that need further development are still all listed. It's just around the level of detail that you speak to for each of those. So I think that as the process moves forward, there is a space around how we've defined now in the process or put forward a definition for the steering committee and council to consider around what ready to implement means. And what further development needs. And that's the sort of first cut before you even get to an assessment or prioritization. And so this is all just a proposal to the steering committee and council. I'm sure it will foster a conversation about how detailed or how not detailed to do this. Look forward to engaging around that. But we have thought about how to deal with those smaller action items in the process and where they would go.
Thank you. Any other questions, comments, thoughts from subcommittee members on what Jane just presented or my follow-up? Cool. Well, we are fortunate to have our own Lauren Oates on the steering council committee, whatever it's called. So I know she's aware of kind of our trajectory and hopefully can keep that in mind as that group discusses this issue going forward. All right. Anything else we want to talk about on the prioritization? Okay. Our next agenda item is public comment. Are we okay to kind of commence with that a couple minutes earlier than what our agenda says? Pat, Jane, is that cool? Okay, great. Well, thanks everyone for being patient with us. This is our first of 2 opportunities for public comment. Anyone who would like to speak right now, please raise your Zoom hand or otherwise audibly make yourself known. Okay, I see Jennifer. I know Zach earlier was interested in speaking. There's Zach's hand. Okay, let's take those 2 folks, Jennifer and Zach, and if others emerge in the interim, we can give them some time as well. Take it away, Jennifer.
Thanks, everybody, as usual. I'm looking forward to the ag stakeholder event. I think it's going to be really exciting to have large-scale public engagement with these issues. I was thinking about the small discussion groups and thinking about that first bullet point, which is, would you recommend any modifications to the approach? And I think that that's too general and broad for a breakout question. And I like the others. I think that they're specific and will really get people thinking about what they're excited about, what they're concerned about. But I sort of worry about that first one. And the other thing that I wanted to mention, I love the idea of a survey at the end. And I was thinking it might do well to have that survey a bit coordinated with those bullet points. Obviously, it doesn't have to be the same thing, but I think having them speak to each other, if you will, would be a good thing. And then the final thing I wanted to mention was I had this sort of, I get stuck on the pathways and strategies and goals and actions. And I really appreciated Marley's comment that, well, wait a minute, the people who are at this meeting aren't going to care. And yet at the same time, I think it's important to be transparent that is the approach that the Vermont Climate Council is going to take. And that's how their ideas are going to end up. So my first thought was, we'll have some definitions of what those are, what the pathways, strategies, goals, actions are, so that people don't get confused. In retrospect, I think that's probably a little too much, but just to think about that a little bit. And I don't know what to recommend, but I worry that people will be dissatisfied if they're feeling like some of those things aren't taken into consideration. So that was basically all. And again, I look forward to the meeting.
Great. That's helpful feedback. Thanks, Jennifer. Zach, take it away.
Thanks. Good morning, everybody. Zach Porter, Conservation Law Foundation. And I'm grateful that the group is, just like Jennifer just said, starting to think about ways to bring in more stakeholders. That's fantastic. And also just wanted to say thanks for the conversation right off the bat this morning about strategies and pathways and actions and how those are being moved forward. I do have a comment. I'm hoping that the portal system worked appropriately and that you all received some comments that I submitted just yesterday, I think it was, about a document from the August 26th Just Transition Subcommittee meeting. And I just wanted to flag one thing from that is still just kind of a lingering concern or question that I didn't quite hear addressed when this group was discussing those topics at the beginning of the meeting today. And that is that I fully understand that there's going to be wordsmithing and efforts to make the pathways and strategies more concise. But what I am concerned about is there's a very big difference between brevity and making something fit more easily on a page compared to potentially putting forward pathways and strategies that aren't inclusive of the recommendations that this group has had a really robust discussion about and actually put forward in its recommendations on July 26th to the Climate Council. So there were several locations in that document where either by mistake or I'll trust that it was with the best of intentions, that the language that was used did not reflect, was not inclusive of scientifically rigorous recommendations that people have suggested through comments to this subcommittee, and then that the subcommittee took forward in its own recommendations to the Climate Council in that presentation. So I realize that there's going to be more vetting that goes on down the road here with actions in particular, but at this point, with this outward-facing document that could potentially go out for public comment sometime soon, I want to make sure that the language that's used is not kind of shutting the door on what could be some of the very best strategies and opportunities that the state has to meet the climate crisis head on. So anyways, I appreciate the chance to just share that comment with you all, and hope that there will be some changes maybe in the next version of that public facing document. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Zach. Okay. Any other members of the public interested in speaking at this time? Okay. I'm going to pause, Jane, because you're not a member of the public and not in this capacity. Okay. Go ahead, Jane.
I just wanted to respond to Zach briefly because I saw your comment and responded to the co-chairs, but just thought I'd take the time to clarify it here so there isn't consternation. Those materials that were on the website that were presented to the Just Transitions Committee were draft. And as there's been review of those materials by both the Just Transition Subcommittee and counselors, there was a subset of counselors who stepped forward to review the collateral. We've been rethinking it and are revising it very substantively. That said, if we were to continue to use a document that attempted to summarize pathways and strategies, the intent was always to bring those to the subcommittees to ensure that the changes that were made to communicate to the public around them were reflective of the intent originally. So I just feel like there was no malintent there, that these is the attempt to try to communicate really technical jargon with very lay public. And so that the feedback would have certainly been brought to the subcommittee to ensure that that was accurately reflecting what was trying to be communicated. So we're just not at that phase yet. So thanks.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think we didn't even see those changes. So things are just moving fast in multiple directions, but thanks for that clarification, Jane. Mr. Field.
I want to, given the public comment, I want to share a slight modification to the questions in the agenda because I appreciated the suggestion to get rid of one and also to start with the positive. And then I thought we might reframe the barriers in a more positive way. So I wanted to see if the committee is okay with this. I got rid of the top question as the public commenter suggested. I think it is really vague. Started with the positive, which I think people mentioned in the chat was important to people. And then rather than talk about barriers, I thought maybe we could ask people, like, given the strategy is relevant to them, what help might they need to make sure they happen or that they're implemented? So those are the changes I made to see if you guys are okay. And then if you are, or any changes here, then we'll get this finalized. Any final kind of comments or thoughts on that? Okay, thumbs ups are helpful just to kind of see where people are. And I can paste all three questions into the chat. Okay. All right, thank you. I will unshare my screen here and
Pat, I have a concern. Well, it's not really a concern. I have a question.
Sure.
In all of this work we've done, is there anything that expresses urgency?
Good question. I think that may be something that the presenters, in terms of as they set this up, need to talk about. You know, I think they need to talk about equity, which isn't explicit in the agenda, and I think they would need to maybe talk about urgency. So I might leave that to Alyssa and David to reflect on, but I think it's a fair question.
I just don't want people to hear all these strategies and think, oh, in 2050 we'll start it.
It's a great point, Judy. And I think as we think about all of these meetings and outreach, I'm trying to figure out the tension, how we resolve the tension between, you know, just inviting input on the specifics and, you know, more practical, like how does this affect people's lives? You know, what are they interested in? Versus how much are we trying to persuade and encourage people to really engage? And I honestly don't know. I mean, you know, part of my job is to really get people fired up. So it's hard for me to not want to talk about the tremendous urgency of this moment. At the same time, I also don't want to, I don't want people to feel like that this is like we're setting up these meetings as a way of just trying to, you know, push a particular agenda. So I welcome other people's thoughts on how we use these meetings in a way that really encourage free and open engagement.
Well, the reason I asked David is because, I don't know, 2 months ago, Abby, Lauren, and I did a presentation with the middle grade school teachers. And the comment we repeatedly heard from them was that parents didn't want them talking about it in school. So if people aren't even talking about it, how are we going to get the urgency out there?
Good point. I think as we as you know, the kind of planning team, as we think about prepping for kind of the broad framing and language, and I don't know what you're going to say about what the Vermont Climate Council itself can say about urgency that you could share as you do your opener for the broader piece. And certainly David and Alyssa can think about this question specific to their presentation as they do that part. Judy, anything else on that?
No, thank you.
Thank you. Lauren and then Iris.
I just want to appreciate Judy flagging that as something that seems really important and grounding the broader reason that we're all here in our respective Zoom rooms. Pat, I appreciate you also saying I was going to recommend or ask Jane or Marion, who are more familiar with the current climate action plan format, that there is going to be an opener about like the current state of climate and climate impacts in Vermont. And I hope that in that section, which really lays the groundwork for the rest of the plan, we can be really explicit, Judy, about how urgent this issue is within our respective subcommittees, but just as a broader, the state of Vermont and as far as the global community actually addressing this now.
Iris?
Yeah, I'm not sure if this is the right time for this conversation, but as we're going into strategies, sorry, is it hard to hear? Just a bit, as we're going into strategies and pathways, I've been looking for a place in this plan where a climate education mandate can fit as a strategy, because I think that's important to Judy's point. And I don't know where that falls, and I haven't seen that in our strategies to date. And so I'm sort of looking for that and hoping to just bring that up as a point that I would love to see in this plan, because I think that's an important part of this work.
Jane, do you know, I mean, I know there's some education strategies in or tactics in some of the spreadsheet you'll see next week, but I'm not sure they're that, Iris. Jane, is the whole Climate Council, how are they handling the broad educational piece and maybe even a requirement?
Well, it feels very much like an obvious cross-cutting idea theme that is coming out of many subcommittees and via strategies and recommendations. So I suspect it'll be one of the things that gets elevated and we think about in that cap drafting process, how we clearly articulate it. So it's not just lost under all the pathways and strategies, but we bring voice to it as meaning that it helps us meet all emissions reductions. It helps us meet building resilient communities and beyond. So yeah, I think that is a really good reminder that is one of those cross-cutting themes that we'll have to think about how we elevate in the climate action plan.
Great, thank you. All right, Billy, are we ready for the next topic?
I think so. Yeah. So basically, we'll need to block a little time at the end of the meeting to talk about next week and to take some more public comment. But the remainder of our time, I think, is going to be focused around trying to begin or to continue the conversation around what we see as like the more difficult issues that we need to discuss as a group to kind of make sure what our collective position is, and where we know that there may be different points of view amongst stakeholders, members of the public, Vermonters. I think this is something David has been encouraging us to do for some time now. Pat's been kind of compiling a list of what some of those topics are. I know it's not exhaustive, but it's a great start. So I don't know, Pat, that's just the kind of framing. And if you want to kind of run with that conversation, I think we'd welcome you to.
So what I've done is I took from the chat a few meetings ago, you all put some potentially kind of difficult issues that you all want to talk about. And then Abby had given some good ideas. So what I can do is just share this list, I think maybe 2 parts today. Let's see if there's, and also, by the way, the task group leads will come back with some specific actions that they think need further discussion too, because they might be challenging or people might disagree. But I thought maybe we could just see if there's any topics to add to this list. And maybe we should start in on a few conversations today about some of those topics potentially. So I can project this. This really came from you all, just to be clear, but it's only a start, as just noted. So, what I call them is big ticket items for discussion. So one is, I think, equity. We really need to continue to figure out a way to have that explicit discussion in all things in all ways. So I put that at the top. There were some things around renewables from kind of the unintended impacts of, like, say, fragmentation and kind of where that ends up going, because it affects obviously your all's concerns in sort of natural and working lands. This question around kind of the unintended consequences of potentially renewables, battery storage, recycling, et cetera. And then also there's a renewable energy and ag and forestry business not counting as emission reductions. There's also a carbon budget question about some of these related things. So those are there. I think an issue that's come up again is, what about consumption reduction, not just energy efficiency, but actually explicitly saying people should reduce their consumption, and that will be good for the climate and for the planet. Forest, at least one around multiple levels of intensity of forest management. I tried to word that carefully because we had some back and forth in chat a few weeks ago. Agriculture is kind of this question of, you know, sort of old and new ag, big and small, and maybe worth some further conversation. There were a number of things around land use, from just kind of the balance of natural working lands versus taking it up for solar fields, for instance. There's the question of regulatory versus incentives. There's the question about climate migration on land use over time. And then there's also this notion of what about, you know, kind of a statewide land use plan kind of approach. And there were a few other things that I weren't sure categorized around emissions profile of all pesticides, and then accounting for actions that go beyond GHG. So these were all items that identified as you have identified as kind of bigger issues to talk about. Want to know if there's other key things that are missing, and maybe we even started on a few of these. So. David, you're.
Yeah, just a quick thing to add. There was an issue that came up that Ryan, Patch, and I have been talking about. I have to admit, I don't fully understand the technical aspects of it, but it has to do with how the state is measuring its progress in terms of carbon emissions targets, and whether or not we can value or take into account in the metrics of this work the benefits that a lot of our recommendations in both the forest and ag sectors include ways of encouraging increased, you know, carbon storage or strategies of increased sequestration and storage of carbon. And Ryan had a concern that sounds pretty straight up to me. Like it's a methodology question about which formulas or models we use to account for carbon. So I wasn't sure if that was is something on your list or not.
And I tried to capture that. I'm not sure, under carbon budget, and Ryan, I'm not sure if that's the right phraseology, is the idea of a carbon budget net accounting versus gross.
Oh, great, thank you.
Yeah, but I'm not sure I worded it right. Alyssa.
I have a kind of a related concern that's come up in some conversations recently with Heather Darby, who's involved with the contract to develop the inventory, and that is that the amount of time that they were kind of given to do that work really limited the extent to which they could be detailed in their accounting of the agriculture sector. And there are some major issues with the way that agriculture's input into the inventory is accounted, and really limits the changes that can be made on farms to influence the overall outcome. So for one example is that changes in feed to cows is something that we know can influence enteric emissions and methane outputs, but that's not a leverage point that's captured in the current way that the inventory is structured. And there are a number of other issues in kind of the model and the amount of time that it takes to run those estimates, that this could be a really important recommendation from our group, is that future work invest in an accurate model that allows for changes on farms that we know can have an impact on overall greenhouse gas emissions in that. And there may be others in this group that have a little more insight, but I think that's one piece that's an issue for our group, and also could be a recommendation, is that eventually the state needs to have a more refined greenhouse gas inventory for the ag sector. And you know, California has a more detailed approach to this, and so there are models for how we could do that. It just takes a bit more capacity in that piece.
Right. Thank you. Ryan, you had your hand up.
Yeah, just wanted to reinforce the comments shared by David and Alyssa. I think greenhouse gas inventory is a good heading, and the work that's ongoing with the technical contractors, I think Alyssa does a very good job to identify some of the gaps that are still going to exist, and creating a framework for accounting for management changes on farms and the potential impact on emissions is concurrent with questions around accounting for how emissions are quantified for different sectors in the state. So we're just trying to say I agree with, very much agree with the importance of addressing this and having it come out as a recommendation And I do think it can be limited to technical review. It's not but it is a very important issue. So I appreciate folks raising that. Thanks.
Judy.
Yeah, this is probably not the question to ask to a lot of ag people, but I've not been known for subtlety. I'm trying to understand of all these strategies, all these actions that we've been working on. We've been working on them, in my understanding, as recommendations. Is there something we're asking as a recommendation that is a mandate? Because if we have all these farmers with all this land going about as business as usual, will there be sufficient change without a mandate?
Judy, I think it applies to both ag and forestry both, so I'm just going to put it in here, but it's probably worth a discussion. So,
Okay.
John.
I don't know why I feel I should respond to Judy, but anyway. So I'm very conflicted about a number of things, but I think farmers have shown, certainly in the last 5 years since we had RAPs, that they do respond to incentives, encouragement, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, we're already, I believe, in a far better place today than we were 10 years ago, 5 years ago. There are changes in practices that have been implemented. Many of the changes that are suggested, like changing feeding of cows, they actually will benefit the bottom line of the farmer. That's sort of the beauty of a lot of this, in my view, is that they actually will make their business more efficient and more productive per dollar invested, and therefore they're encouraged. They will be encouraged to take this on. They will need the education. They will need the demonstration. They will need, the resources, most of them technical, to take on this role. But I think they're very game to do that. We can. I don't think we have anywhere near enough time to go into all the details of the economics of the ag industry and, of course, the dairy industry and et cetera, et cetera. This is not the place, but I'm a very optimistic person about how farmers will react to a lot of this. I think they've shown that they can make changes. Now, of course, what some people may think of as changes, I mean, we will certainly see, and I'm sure we'll see it at this stakeholders meeting, or maybe not see it, we'll hear it. There are people of good, sound minds who believe regenerative agriculture, for example, or their interpretation of regenerative agriculture is the only way. And there are others who feel their farming system is the only way. I think one of the beauties of ag is, what I used to do on my farm, what I see on the farm that I look out at every day, is sort of totally different to what I see on the farm to the north of me or to the west of me. There are so many ways of skinning this cat. And I hasten to add, as you know, because you see my cat, that I love cats. You know, there are so many different ways, exciting ways of making production agriculture work that I think we have a big area. And I don't think I do think that maybe we need some sort of, I don't know whether it's mandatory but we need some sort of limits like, well, I won't go into what I think should be the limits right now, but, you know, we might need some backstops. We talked about that years ago, David, and the RAPs. You know, you needed backstops to make sure people did not do the wrong thing. But so I'm encouraged, and I think farmers will respond. Thank you.
Thanks, John. Abby.
Yeah, I just wanted to also say, I think I completely take your point, Judy, and I don't think that you're wrong. I think there are, to John's point, there's places for mandates. I think some of what, if I can just be completely frank, what the farming community sometimes struggles with is this, and I know that the farming community is stewarding an enormous amount of land and resources, and therefore needs to be held to a certain level of account. But I still believe that the public doesn't have a full or complete understanding of the level of regulation and mandate that farmers are already operating under. And not that that means that there shouldn't be more, but I just think that sometimes what it feels like from the farming community's perspective is that we become highly mandated or have programs put forward, et cetera. And then those same standards aren't set to apply to other aspects of industry, which is why, for example, I flagged the usage of pesticides within our grid structure. And, you know, if we're going to be having increased renewable energy, you know, what does that mean for the grid? What does that mean for the pesticide load there? Where are the other places? You know, it tends to be that farmers actually are a fairly adaptive group. To John's point, they are constantly dealing with markets. And so I think that's part of it too, is the market is I believe, going to take care of a lot of this over time. And so it's how can we sort of shepherd along and provide the incentive structure and the education for people to be equipped to do the things that we need to do to remain resilient in the face of a changing climate. But a lot of it comes down to money and resources, and that's kind of where we're at. So I would just encourage that as we're thinking towards, or when we're thinking towards mandates or mandatory practices, that however we frame them, they be cross-sectoral and not just focused on agriculture. If we're going to, put a regulation out on something, it needs to be, that needs to go across industries. Thanks.
But David Mears.
Yeah, just a quick reaction to that. And then I wanted to suggest another, I think, a really important topic. This is often framed as an either or, and I spent my whole life and career working in regulatory stuff, and some pretty wedded to the regulatory piece. But I also know that if it's just regulations alone, we won't get there. There has to be a mix of incentives and recognition of a whole set of broader forces, including market forces. But I absolutely believe we need to have a both and approach to this. It can't be just incentives and just technical assistance and education outreach. We have to think about how to use regulatory authority. I don't mean, that's just my perspective. Others may disagree. The other thing I think that's really important, I was thinking about this in some ways more about process within the Climate Council than about the actual issue. I assume that there's a shared agreement across the Climate Council that we need to have. In fact, I've been hearing conversations from other people on other subcommittees that there's a lot of conversation happening about state land use planning and the need for kind of a state and at least regional level plans for how we find the right balance. And I could easily imagine that, if you were asked, how to, promote solar energy, you would just want to put solar energy everywhere. But, when you balance that against the impacts on wetlands and farmland and forest, it's not quite so simple. And anyway, and statewide planning has been, since the inception of Act 250 back in the 60s, when we had state land use regulations, it has been a political football that gets kicked back and forth and back and forth. I'm hopeful that we can somehow find a way to break out of this being a partisan political issue and into a local versus state fight, and more into a really thoughtful set of recommendations that make the point where we have to keep our forests and agriculture and open lands in the mix. And that feels like an important message for this subcommittee in particular to send, and that we need to think about how to send it, not just, probably our first burden or barrier is to figure out how to convey that message across the rest of the Climate Council and make sure that if there are disagreements on that perspective, that we flesh those out.
David, anything else? Okay, Ryan and then Judy.
Thanks. Yeah, just wanted to not belabor the point, but just provide outputs from the work that's been ongoing in the water quality sphere. Modeling from EPA showed that agriculture can provide the most cost-effective investments for phosphorus on a per kilogram basis compared to other sectors, and that's why the TMDL leverages agriculture so heavily. As it relates to regulations, we have built a protocol methodology for accounting both the regulatory requirements for the required agricultural practices, as well as the voluntary programs that farmers participate in to implement conservation practices. No such protocol at this time has been developed to quantify the climate co-benefits of those practices, but all of that data exists. By way of looking at the relative scale of performance between the regulatory inspection program and voluntary programs, both state and federal, as we know, agriculture has been responsible for between 99 to 96% of all reported phosphorus reductions in the state since 2016, for which about 14 to 15% of that comes from the agricultural regulatory programs. The balance of that, around 85%, comes from voluntary financial assistance programs. Looking to Pennsylvania's climate action plan and analysis of the cost to the public and return on investment, again, agricultural field practices come out as those that have a negative cost or a positive return to people in Pennsylvania. And I would imagine an analysis of that for agriculture in the climate space would identify agriculture as having a net positive benefit as well here. So we're looking at this space, looking at the regulatory, looking at agriculture, right, there exists a robust ag non-point source pollution control program for which climate benefits have not been quantified, but certainly could be, and for which, as an example, under Section 6.04A of the RAPs, under our soil health management and cover crop requirements, there exists the direction for farms to utilize soil health practices and identify those practices that are most effective at achieving those outcomes. So looking at quantifying, and that's why looking at, to the prior comments around the emissions inventory and being able to track the positive outcomes from environment, management that farmers adopt, I think is an important place to start to understand what are we getting from the current framework for which benefits have not yet been quantified, but they have been tracked. As far as the practices that are implemented are tracked for phosphorus reduction reporting, so could they be tracked and accounted for in the climate space as well. So sorry, I think I went a bit longer than I wanted to, just trying to share how that framework and approach both a regulatory baseline that exists and does apply to all farms in the state, as well as the tracking and accounting need, as well as the effectiveness and cost effectiveness of technical and financial assistance for farms. Thanks.
Great, thanks, Ryan. Judy, then I just have a question for you all. Judy, go ahead.
Yeah, I just want to make it clear that my question about mandatory and agriculture and all of that is not coming from a vacuum. My family was the last family to farm at the Ethan Allen homestead, and my great grandfather had 16 children, and all but one have farms in Vermont. My grandmother's farm is still 400-acre farm. It's just down the road from Taft's Corners. So I am very much a part of farming, and that's where my question's coming from, because I hear them talk about, yeah, it's my land. I pay the taxes. Nobody's going to tell me what to do. And that's where my question is coming from. I agree with Abby, anything that becomes a mandate should be cross-sector. And I love John's enthusiasm and hopefulness. I just think that's great. But I do agree with David that whatever we do, there needs to be a balance for everyone and a balance for all things. Whether it's a mandate, a suggestion, or whatever, there needs to be balance in that. I just feel that sometimes when you're talking about generations of people in the same spot, that ownership is so strong. And that thought of what I'm doing has worked for 15 generations and it's going to continue to work. So nobody's going to tell me what to do. That is what I'm talking about, that particular thought that some farmers have.
Maybe when we look at some of the actions under the strategies for ag next week and ongoing, some of these specific potentially things that may be mandates versus incentives may arise. So I think we'll start to look at those. But as Judy said, I think there's the power and beauty of agriculture is often a long, strong commitment to the land and to ways of doing. And the downside is sometimes it's the same ways of doing that maybe aren't so great, for sure.
Right.
I come from ag too, so I say that from my own family ranch having some of the same problems.
Pat, I have one more comment.
Sure.
I don't think equity should be a separate thing. I think equity should be in each one of these things.
Let's move it around here. Ryan, why don't you go ahead? And then I have a question actually about the GHG inventory in a second, but Ryan, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks. Just Judy, wanted to take your perspective and share, I think, a process that was useful to build buy-in. You can't regulate your way out of a problem. It's often a cultural change to, address at least the clean water. And I think, starting back in 2013, an ag working group, 96 outreach meetings, investment in local partners that can provide outreach to farmers, listening to farmers through, collaborative stakeholder process is important to build buy-in. And I think that what we're seeing in the results from the agricultural project with regards to total share of phosphorus reductions and just scale of adoption going from 6,000 acres of cover crop to 36,000 in 4 years, and that's over a third of the state's cropland being cover crop. That comes from farmer engagement and willingness to participate. And so that took many years, right? Starting in 14 ag working group, Act 64 in 2015, and implementation for the past 6 years. In this climate space, we're lucky that much of that work can be quantified for climate. And so building that additional buy-in and urgency, I think you'll find from the Payment for Ecosystem Services working group process, the farmers themselves coming to the legislature to request support for them and willing and wanting to do more. I think you'll find, a starting point that's much advanced into specific climate council work as it comes to sequestration and emission reduction, adaptation, resiliency goals for the state that agriculture can provide. So making sure in our recommendations, that's where the partnership and education outreach technical assistance is so important to, you know, capacitate and unlock the you know, the opportunities that farmers see on their land to, you know, contribute to this effort. So just wanted to share my feedback and experience with a separate but perhaps related process in building programs that deliver the environmental benefit the state would like to see. Thanks.
I have a specific question to the GHG inventory one. I know this has actually been kind of circling around us for a bit. I wonder if someone wants to draft a recommendation for the group there. I don't think it's embedded in our strategies and actions right now, but there's a broader statement about, you know, inventory 2.0 or whatever. I wonder if someone here, if the subcommittee agrees, to go ahead and draft a recommendation for that, and then we can look at it in the next coming weeks. Jane.
I've just been having some back and forth chat with Ryan a little bit about this because the greenhouse gas inventory recommendation is coming to the council on September 14th to adopt. So the idea being that there's a consensus reached within science and data around the task group that was working on the greenhouse gas inventory specifically around any changes and modifications that should be made to the inventory going forward. And so I wanted to be mindful that that recommendation has reached consensus at Science and Data, both from the task group and then at the subcommittee, and that I think it's important if there are still lingering concerns that I invite Ryan and Justin to meet with that group sooner rather than later about that. But Ryan and Justin have been part of those conversations from the beginning around the inventory. So a little bit of misunderstood of how that's not folding into the consideration around the recommendation coming from Science and Data. But I would just like to say that I think that resides in Science and Data, although I would like to have Ryan and Justin meet with that group again. And then of course, as counselors, I would encourage you to weigh in at the council meeting if the recommendations that are coming from Science and Data around the greenhouse gas inventory are not representative of what you would like to see.
Happy I saw your hand up, so I didn't know if you wanted to go.
Yeah, sorry, it's so windy. I will try to connect with at least somebody from Science and Data about this, because Ryan and Judson have been working really hard on it, and this is really important, and I am incredibly concerned about the resistance we've faced in trying to get ag appropriately represented. And so I will try to follow up on that as well. But I would second the notion that we need to craft a specific recommendation to this, to having these gaps captured somehow moving forward.
Ryan, I have a question. I want to put you on the spot, but to Jane's question, in engaging with that committee around the inventory, is it that they haven't incorporated your concerns or issues, that they say that's for version 2.0 or something else, just so the subcommittee here understands potentially the challenges?
I think the review that was asked of the contractor does not delve into the sector-specific nuances that we are raising, though we do think it is, you know, an important part for the baseline inventory. So as far as looking at, you know, does a workbook approach meet the needs of being able to inventory emissions in the state? I mean, sure, it comes from EPA. It's based on factors that can be adjusted at the state level. And for that reason, the review, I don't think, has gotten into sector specifics, or at least the agricultural sector. As you look at many of, you know, whether it's cross-sector mitigation presentation or others, you know, agriculture and natural working lands are kind of this other category. It is a bit more difficult to conceptualize and model, or at least in Vermont hasn't been at the forefront of the modeling that's been developed. So it's a resource gap, and so this is my long way of saying, not sure the contractor delved into that detail, though we do think it is important to include, and so appreciate the conversation we've had here today, and certainly happy to meet and share that. And we have drafted some specific recommendations, and I'm happy to share with the group. We have shared that through the 5C recommendations, but we can definitely work on drafting at a subcommittee as well what would work best for an emissions inventory that follows IPCC standards and gives us the ability to track and estimate the reductions we may already be getting from farmer management.
So I think maybe why don't we just, whether it ends up being a direct recommendation from you all or it gets somehow sent into the mix through the Data and Science Committee at some point, I wonder whether it would be helpful just to write down what the concerns or the ask is or asks, and then we have it in writing and then we can figure out what to do with it. But I just want to know who maybe could do that in a way that you all could look at as a subcommittee in a week or two, and then we can decide what to do with it. Is that, Brian, something you do? Alyssa, something you can do? I don't know who can do that best.
We are trying to schedule a 5C subtask group meeting in part to discuss this. And so we're happy to, I'll volunteer, happy to talk about it with that subtask group, but bring it back to the full subcommittee for discussion, laying out, we've, a lot of documentation, but perhaps a succinct, one pager and potential language for a recommendation that we can bring forward for consideration. And it is a bit separate than strategies and pathways. It's this kind of technical thing that can be addressed separately from the kind of strategies and actions that we want to see deployed. It's kind of this separate technical question, which I think can be elevated in a distinct way and addressed in that manner.
Okay, so maybe 5C can come back to us with whether you put up some slides together or one page or whatever, just I think to help clarify this issue, and then the subcommittee can decide exactly where to take it. Okay, good. Thanks for offering that. All right. Any other, we either want to, we have about, I think, Billy, maybe 5 minutes left before public comment and action items. This is probably a good list to check back as we go through strategies and actions next week and the following to make sure we did hit on some of the key issues. But anything other items you want to list or any other quick comments on any of these topics you want to make? We obviously only talked about just a few.
Not for me, but thank you. This was the exact sort of discussion we need to dive into as we move forward. And I think the exercise of organizing the strategies and action items will surface additional topics, but I think your list is a good one. So thanks, everyone.
David.
Yeah, just a quick question for you, Billy. I'm not, maybe it's a Lauren question, but I am, what is the best way to tee up the question of, the land use balance piece? I know it's been a little bit of, I know there's been some discussion around it within the Climate Council and between the subcommittee leadership, but I'm not sure, I'm trying to think about how this subcommittee can best advance and promote that issue, which I know, partly I was thinking of you, Billy, because I know it's an issue that you live in, that whole tension. So I just wondered, is there a need or an opportunity to have some kind of discussion within the Climate Council to tee that up early so that we don't have recommendations crossing in the night at the tail end of the process as it all gets pulled together?
Yeah, no, thank you, David, for that. I guess a couple things. First, we, as the task groups met this morning, I think we are identifying kind of a strategy path around, minimizing and mitigating impacts on the natural and working landscape from energy generation. So I think that's like a bucket under which many of these concepts can fall. And, we're going to need to work through the details of as a group. But I think that's certainly one of the topper line things that we're looking at. There's also a conversation convened amongst the subcommittee co-chairs of our subcommittee, rural resilience and cross-sector mitigation, talk at these broader land use issues and how we all kind of reconcile our goals and strategies. That conversation's just begun, but I think that is where we can bring some of these concerns to cross sector, who is really focused on the energy generation side, and make sure that where the direction we're heading is a workable one, and if not, get their feedback and kind of bring that back to the group to consider. As far as like the ultimate reconciliation of interests, I think that's going to rest with the council. And, I'm sure that this will be one of many topics that they need to grapple with. And my hope is that, Jane and others in the steering committee are thinking about how to kind of answer those questions at that level. But, to summarize, I think we as a subcommittee through the task lead work are working to refine those strategies and action items and recommendations. We'll bring those back to this group next week to dig into. We're beginning to talk across subcommittees with rural resilience and cross sector about how these things work together to make sure we all achieve our goals and interests. And then I would imagine there's going to be some process within the council itself to resolve things if we're not able to at our level. So I hope that's helpful.
Laura and then Jane.
Yeah, just to piggyback off of what Billy said, it's my understanding that the Climate Action Plan Development Task Committee, or whatever it's going to be called, is likely to pass at the steering committee. We're going to talk about it again at our Tuesday meeting, and part of the roles and responsibilities of that group is to identify those cross-cutting themes and strategies. So hopefully that can kind of come out. In the meeting this morning with the task leads, we already started to flag some of those broader strategies as seeming to have significant overlap with rural resilience, for example. So hopefully that can be a soon to be formalized landing ground for a lot of these issues. And to Billy's point, I think eventually land use will have to come up at the full council level too.
Jane.
Yeah, sure. So I was just gonna provide a little more clarity on the land use issue and how we've started to work on it, recognizing that there was a need to advance coordination sooner rather than later because of where the subcommittees are right now with action development. So the meeting that Billy referred to happened earlier this week, and the to-do list sort of up from that was for folks specific invested in land use, specifically some of the now counselor designees, because Secretary Curley has officially designated to Chris Cochran her spot on the council, to look at the CAP outline and think about how land use, which is like the major cross-cutting theme, gets reflected in the climate action plan outline, and then also thinks about how we then pull together how actions and the how gets fleshed out, recognizing that like in transportation, for instance, they have a lot of tasks or actions, I should say, associated with land use. And while they're really critical for emissions reductions long-term, they're not a primary emissions strategy for us to get to 2025 and 2030. So rather than having the transportation task leads focused explicitly on fleshing out actions, there may be an efficiency in recognizing that a primary group, as long as it all ties back to resilience, adaptation, emissions, that actions associated with land use could be vetted in one place and developed in one place. And so right now, that Marion and myself got a revised CAP outline from Bronwyn Cook and Chris Cochran, thinking about how land use fits in that we're looking at. And then the next step was to pull this group back together around land use, not until the week of September 13th, allowing that tagging of strategies and actions at the subcommittee level to happen first.
Do we know who was in the land use group, just so we can name the folks who participated in that conversation?
Yeah, sure. Billy represented your subcommittee. Joey, Gina, and Peter Walk represented cross sector. Chris Cochran, Bronwyn, and Catherine Dimitrick represented rural resilience.
Great, thank you.
And I'll just say that I was an invitee, and I don't know what the conversations were with Abby, but she certainly she just put in the text. I certainly want you to be there, Abby. And I think I made that known at the meeting that, we should both be there if possible. So certainly wasn't my intent to exclude you. I don't think it was anybody's, but I was concerned about that myself.
Anything else on that we'll probably do public comment, action items, and wrap for today. Co-chairs, anything else for now? Could we do public comment and action items the other way around, Billy? I'll turn it back to you.
Let's do some quick action items. I think.
Can I just cut in?
Yeah, go for it.
Sorry, I just wanted to check. Jane, did you say that there was a revised CAP outline? No? Okay. I thought that there's.
We've gotten some edits from Bronwyn and Chris to consider for how we could think about land use. And that's all going to be discussed at the September 14th Climate Council meeting.
Okay. Sounds good. Thanks.
Okay. So I think for action items, the task leads are going to come together hopefully Wednesday and produce kind of a document that kind of organizes all of our work in a more digestible way that we will share with this group in advance of Friday. So then we'll probably have an agenda item next Friday to kind of do a deep dive into that work. And so an action item, a task for everyone is to kind of review whatever you get to the extent possible in advance of next Friday. I think we probably want to continue this conversation on some level around big picture issues that need more debate or conversation amongst this group. So if there's other topics along those lines, please think about those on your own and bring them to us to discuss. Jane, Pat, Marion, there may be other specific agenda items that we're going to bring to this group next week. I'd ask you to share and whether we need to do any kind of preparation in advance of those.
I'm just trying to think, Billy, with the sorry, I was reading in chat as you were speaking. Sorry about that. I think when you guys meet with to figure out the matrix, if you maybe can think and I can think with you about how we can help the group walk through that in a specific way, and obviously having that available ahead of time so people can at least glance at it, I think will be super helpful as we do that for sure. And it may be one of the things that we haven't really talked about, but I think next week is for sure online. I know the Delta variant makes everything harder, but if we struggle next week with getting through everything, and we have a time schedule here, right? Then it may be we want to think about maybe the meeting after that in person if we need to help us kind of get across the finish line, which I know is a big if, but just I want to put on the table is just in the back of your mind.
Okay, everyone got that? Okay, great. Well, let's turn it back over to the folks who've been patiently with us today for any additional comment or questions. Please raise your hands, anyone who'd like to talk. All right. I see Jennifer, Zach, and Jamie. Jamie, since you're a new commenter to our group, why don't we let you go first? Then we can go with Zach, and Jennifer can wrap things up for us today. Go ahead, Jamie.
Thanks, Billy. I don't have a particular point to make. I just want other VNRC staff members have been participating and listening to your discussions. And just because I was here today, I just wanted to say thank you to all of you for the hard work you're doing. That's all I have.
Thanks. Go ahead, Jennifer.
I think Zach was going to go next.
Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead, Zach.
Thanks. We are a very kind group, or at least I hope that's everyone else's impression anyways. Yeah, just wanted to just jump in with a comment that I was really glad that, well, this won't surprise anyone either, that clean water came up today. Because I think so many of our opportunities here in front of us are really unique to this subcommittee, ag and ecosystems, are of a multi-solving variety. And I don't know if you've used the word multi-solving before, but to me, it's a word that I really hope we all kind of aspire to use or incorporate into our planning. And, you know, it's what we've been talking about here, I think all along, but maybe haven't touched on directly, which is how can we take steps right now in, you know, this world where it's just one crisis after another, you know, seems to befall us. How do we take steps that address many of those crises at once? And so we are on the cusp of talking about some of those opportunities, and I'm excited that we're going to maybe get into more in-depth conversations about things like intensity of management of our natural and working lands. So great to hear, and yeah, look forward to those conversations. Thank you.
Thanks, Zach. And Jennifer, before you jump in, I need to kind of wrap back to something that we just discussed with the group to clarify a previous statement. So once Jennifer's done, if folks could just hang on for a second, I'll do that. So after you, Jennifer.
Just wanted to make a quick comment on any greenhouse gas inventory or carbon budget. And I was concerned by the notion that the hayfields are going to be modeled as wheat fields in Vermont. And I'm just wondering if there's any opportunity for, in the best possible scenario, looking at different models that might accommodate what Vermont has in terms of land types. And if that's not possible, then at least flagging those scenarios which will be inaccurate. Thanks.
Thanks, Jennifer. And then just quickly, I want to clarify, I may have been the reason why Abby wasn't included in that recent land use meeting. There's obviously a lot going on with all these different meetings. I think a question may have been asked to me as to whether I could represent this group at that meeting. I said yes. I think I assumed that was because Abby was not available or for whatever reason. So that was my mistake. It's certainly not our intent to keep Abby out of these meetings. Actually, I definitely want her at my side for every conversation that we have representing this group. So that was that may have been a mistake on my part, but it certainly was the intent. So don't you know, people don't freak out that there's any grand plan to exclude our fearless co-leader from these important conversations. It was probably just a hasteful decision that I made that was misinformed. So apologies for that. And Abby, look forward to having you there going forward. Cool. So with that, I think we're done for today. Thanks, everyone. Have a good week, good long weekend if you are able to enjoy it, and we'll see you next week.
You all.